Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Camila Dos Santos, and I'm the Program Coordinator of the Healthy Relationships Initiative. And you are joining us today for our program on making tough choices and setting boundaries during the holidays. This is the second of our third of the holiday programming series. We do have another program next week, so we're glad that you've connected with us to learn a little bit more about how to navigate some tough choices that we all have to make during the holiday season, and then also how to set some boundaries around those choices to make sure that you're not only taking care of your family and your loved ones, but that you're also taking care of your well-being during the holidays, which we know can be pretty stressful. So before we get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Healthy Relationships Initiative. As I mentioned, I'm the program coordinator of this initiative, and we do have our director on with us today as well, Dr. Christine Murray. But the HRI was founded between UNC Greensboro and the Phillips Foundation, and our mission is to promote happy, healthy, and safe relationships of all kinds in the community. We do this in large part by hosting and co-hosting different events in Guilford County and beyond. And we also have a number of different resources on healthy relationship topics. And so they range from webinars and articles to different videos and blogs, as well as professional trainings for those who work in mental health or in education and other types of fields as well. And so today, our agenda, we're going to start by really talking about the different kinds of choices that people have to make right now and the different stressors that are impacting those choices. And then we'll get into some different ways to actually think about how to make those decisions and then how to set boundaries around those decisions. And then we'll close our conversation today by just addressing the importance of self-care around the holidays and how you can find the time for self-care during such a busy and hectic time. So before we get started today, I'd like to thank everybody for being here with us and encourage everyone to share your thoughts or questions or comments either in the chat room through Zoom or by making a comment on our Facebook for those who are joining us on Facebook Live. And so I'd like to start our discussion today by just asking the question of what are some of the tough choices that you might be facing this holiday season or that you think some folks might be facing this holiday season? We encourage you to just share those in the chat room or to share them on Facebook. You can either do that to Dr. Christine Murray or you can post publicly. And so I'm seeing some in the chat room, you know, the idea of whether to visit family who live far away during COVID times is something that people are really facing and struggling with right now. And then as well as we know that we live in a world where family lives in different states and in different countries. And so for those that have adult children in different states, that can be tough to think about making those decisions around travel. And some other sort of stressors and questions that people are facing right now is, do we have a family gathering? How much do we spend on gifts? This pandemic has really changed the way we live, and it's also impacted people's financial situations right now. And so there's a lot of financial stress around gift giving and just how to celebrate the holidays. There's also a lot of concern for people who have older adults and vulnerable populations in the family. Many people have older adults living in assisted living or in nursing homes, and that can be really difficult to make that choice as to whether or not you involve that family member in your holiday gathering. And those are some tough choices for families to make because you don't want to feel like you're isolating certain family members, but you certainly want to keep them safe. And then, we've mentioned the finances and the economic concerns as well as those travel concerns as well. What's important to note for today's program, though, is that I'm certainly not a public health expert and I am not a medical doctor. So I will not be making any statements today on what is sort of the best public health policy as you think about the choices for your family. I think for each of us, it's important for us to consider the restrictions and our local situation as well as situations in other states regarding the pandemic. But for the purposes of today's program, I do encourage you to think about that in the context of your own family. We'll be addressing more so the relationship implications of these choices and the things that you can do to sort of overcome the stressors of the holidays. So let's talk about those stressors. I think there's a lot of things right now that are impacting people's ability to make good decisions. And some of those things that are stressing people out are, in general, the stress of the pandemic, the stress of the multiple responsibilities that people are facing. We've got parents who've turned into at-home teachers while also having to manage their full-time work. We've got caregivers in difficult situations trying to navigate, keeping their family safe while also tending to their responsibilities. Many of us are facing just uncertain school schedules or uncertain openings, and also closures for those who are in school face-to-face. Sometimes those schools get closed down due to the pandemic. So there's just a lot going on right now, which makes it difficult for people to plan long-term. But it also makes it difficult for you to think clearly about making these decisions as well. So when we talk about making tough choices, we've addressed some of the things that people are considering, but I wanted to dive into some different strategies to help you think about those tough choices and think about how you can make them in your own family. And so one of the more common causes of conflict in relationships, especially around the holidays, is when people have miscommunications and conflicts about what to expect about the holidays. And so you might have experienced this before, where maybe you have an idea for what Thanksgiving might look like in your family. And maybe your idea for Thanksgiving is that you'll have your immediate family, your kids, maybe a close aunt or something, but maybe you don't expect a super large gathering. Well, if you're not communicating your expectations openly with other decision makers in your family, it's likely that somebody else might have a very different idea about that Thanksgiving gathering, whether maybe that's your partner or your spouse, or maybe that is somebody like your grandmother or your mother, somebody that you might care for who lives in the home with you. And so it's really important to communicate what you expect about the holidays, so that people don't sort of have these internal ideas that are very different from one another. And so when you're having these conversations, answering questions to each other, such as, what are our expectations? Do we expect a large gathering? Do we expect a more intimate setting? What are our concerns about those expectations? How concerned are we about vulnerable populations within our family? Are there older adults we need to consider, or maybe have alternative ways to celebrate? What are our deal breakers? What are some things that we definitely don't want to do or don't want to be a part of? And that can be things like, maybe for your family, you're not going to participate in that large family reunion because that might not be the safest option for your family. But what's important is to talk about those things and talk about them in advance, right? So we don't want to have conversations about Thanksgiving a couple of days before Thanksgiving. We want to give people opportunities and chances to not only share what their expectations are, but then also to have enough time to come up with a compromise if you disagree, right? And so that second piece is, what's the compromise? If I want to have a large gathering, but my partner doesn't, can we meet in the middle? Or can we do an outdoor dinner with half of that group? And so really thinking about what that compromise looks like within the family. And then, of course, when we're talking about the holidays, and like anything in life, not everything goes as planned, right? So what's that backup plan for your family going to look like? And really having those details in place so that when things change last minute, or when so-and-so can't come to the gathering, you have a backup plan in place to kind of limit the stress for plan B. And then the other important thing to consider is, who are those decision makers in your family? And thinking that it's going to look different for different families. So in some families, it might be you and your spouse who make these decisions about the holidays. Whereas in other families, you might need to involve others, such as a live-in family member or somebody else, maybe the patriarch or the matriarch of the family, who tends to kind of get everybody together. And so those decision makers within your own family can look pretty different. But in general, one of the most important strategies to sort of minimize the stress around making tough choices is to communicate those expectations and ideas and decisions transparently, so that everybody knows what to expect, and that you're not sort of harboring some unrealistic ideas about what the holidays can look like and then be disappointed later on. Another strategy to sort of have in mind as you think about these tough choices during the holidays is to really reflect on your own expectations about the holidays, as well as to dispel the myths you might be telling yourself about the holiday season. And so, we live in a world where it's really easy to get caught up in the idea that the holidays should be perfect, right? We see the Hallmark movies and we watch on TV these holiday gatherings that, it seems like every dish and every dessert is cooked on the table and every family member is there and everyone's having a great time. But the reality is that the holidays come with both negative and positive emotions, because for many people, they can highlight strained relationships. They can highlight stressors that we might have, or past conflicts, or resentment and guilt. And so it's not all good all the time. And I think often we have these expectations for ourselves and for what the holidays should look like, that aren't realistic. And so then when things don't turn out the way we have this idea in our mind, we get really disappointed, and we might blame ourselves or others for the reality of the holidays, which is, just like anything in life, it's not always a positive celebration. Sometimes there's some stressors involved. And so when we think about these expectations that we set for ourselves without even knowing that we do, it can look like, I'm going to get the whole family together this year and everyone's going to get along, right? Or I'm going to help so-and-so repair their conflict from last year's Christmas. Or no problem, we can go to all 3 of those Thanksgiving dinners. Of course, I can make 4 different desserts, right? And whether you haven't been in that exact situation or not, you've probably set some unrealistic expectation for what you're able to do during the holidays at some point. And so it's really important to reflect on those and to allow yourself the space to say, no, we can't attend 3 different Thanksgiving dinners, or no, we'll focus on 1 dessert this year because I don't have the time or the bandwidth to do 4 different ones, right? And then also sort of dispelling these ideas that you can help repair every conflict in your family, or that you can get everyone together. That's a lot of pressure on one person. And often when, it doesn't go exactly as we planned, we put that pressure on ourselves and that guilt on ourselves. So it's really important to reflect on your expectations and then dispel those myths you tell yourself. So for example, here are some myths that you might tell yourself around the holidays that aren't super helpful to actually making you feel good about the holiday season. They actually put a lot of stress on how you feel about the holidays. And so some of these myths that people might tell themselves around the holidays are, if I've got everything planned ahead of time, if I've got all my ducks in a row, then nothing can go wrong. So we know that's not true, right? We know things happen that are outside of our control. And I'm a planner. I plan everything, but I know during the holidays that even if I write everything down and plan everything days in advance, things happen. People's travel plans get delayed or canceled. That dish gets burned, right? So things happen, and we kind of have to have that concept in mind so that we're not super hard on ourselves when they don't go exactly as planned. Another thing that people often do around the holidays is they connect their behavior to that of others, right? And so what that looks like is, if I organize this Thanksgiving dinner, and if I, seat everybody at the table exactly as so, then we won't have any conflicts at dinner, and it'll be a positive experience, right? Or if I make sure that Aunt Sally feels comfortable at Christmas dinner, then maybe she won't make those mean comments about my husband, right? Or whatever that looks like in your family, because we all know families aren't perfect. And so there's conflict in all relationships. And so what's important to sort of dispel is that we can only control our own behavior, and we cannot control the behaviors of others, nor can we really sway the behaviors of others with what we do. So during the holiday season, it's important to remember you can only control what you do, and you can hope for the best that your good behavior will bring about the good behaviors of others. But we know that that's not always the case. So it's important to dispel that myth. Another important myth to kind of dispel, and I mentioned it a little bit earlier, is that in general, the holidays are not always a joyous time for everyone, and they're certainly not a joyous time all of the time, right? So while the holidays are great time to get together and really enjoy that time with family, there's also a lot of negative emotions that could potentially come up. And so remembering that the holidays can sometimes be upsetting, or if you've had a loss and are grieving someone, can be more challenging to deal with because you miss that person when you're gathering with others, or you just miss having the holidays with a particular person. So when we have that in mind, and when we know that it's not always going to be happy all of the time, it helps us have more realistic ideas about what the holidays will look like. I did have a really good question come up that I'm going to address now because I think it's super relevant for this slide. And the question is, what can you do if politics come up at the holiday dinner table with family and you aren't comfortable with your family members' viewpoints and they're not being respectful of yours? And that's a really relevant and timely question right now. And so I'd like to first say that we do have a specific HRI resource on this topic. It's called Maintaining Healthy Relationships During Election Season. And there are a lot of great strategies to sort of deal with conflict, have respectful conversations around politics, and find different ways to engage people so that you have good discussions, but you also practice those listening skills and respect. So I do encourage people to check out that resource. But for the purposes of this program and in thinking about the holidays, I think that the first thing to consider is that if the holiday is taking place at your house, so if you are the host, I think it's perfectly acceptable to set some standards and some boundaries around the types of discussions that come up at the dinner table. And so maybe if that's something that you're anticipating might come up, you and your partner or you and another family member might want to have some sort of a catchphrase or some sort of a discussion changer, so a topic change, something that you can change the topic with pretty quickly, to just gear conversations away from those kinds of topics, especially during the holidays. So that might be a choice that might be a decision that you make, right? That you will not allow conversations about politics at the dinner table, and you might find some ways to work through that if it comes up, so that it's not super awkward or negative, but still kind of gets the point across. So what that can look like is, well, I'll just share something that I often say in my family or in my gatherings is I often say, we're here to enjoy each other's company, and nobody's minds are going to get changed over dinner today. So why don't we talk about other things and things that, enjoy our time together, and talk about things that make us happy and not things that make us fight. Because what we don't want to do is spend this whole time talking about politics and then go home and feel like we haven't really shared this time together. So that's my little sort of spiel that I do. And it often works because I try to just remind the people that I'm with that we want to spend time together, and we don't want that time to be spent arguing about things that we likely aren't going to change anybody's minds about. So that's one way to really navigate that. Another way to navigate that sort of politics around the table is to maybe you choose to have those discussions. I know a lot of families bond over those topics and really enjoy talking about politics. And so I think in that case, it's important to set some boundaries before the conversation starts, maybe encouraging people to use I statements when they share their opinions, and then also not allowing disparaging comments such as, I can't believe you think that, or that's so dumb that you think that, and really cutting those off if that happens immediately. So I think that's an internal family decision whether you choose to have those discussions or not. But I think what's important around these discussions is setting some boundaries. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to do that as well. Great question. Moving on to a third strategy in making tough choices. And this is a tough one for many of us because oftentimes we might make a decision and then we don't stick to it, or we're afraid to kind of communicate it openly because maybe we're not super certain of that decision that we've made. So what's important to remember is that once you've made your decisions around what the holidays will look like for you, especially if you've made that decision in partnership with the decision makers, so if that's your partner or your spouse or anyone else in your family, once the group has made that choice, it's really important to stick to that choice, because then you can minimize confusion that way. So when you think about, making the choice and really remembering that, you've talked through those decisions. And so there's a rationale behind that choice that you've made. The best thing that you can do is communicate that choice to everybody who needs to know. So what that might look like is, for example, in my family, my partner and I, we have decided that we will not be traveling for Christmas this year. And so we've communicated that to everyone who sort of needs to know, so that there aren't people in our family who might be having some expectations about us being there for Christmas. And while that was hard to communicate on the front end, it just minimizes the confusion for people. And so now people know that we won't be there at Christmas, and we've been able to find some alternatives. So, maybe we can tune in on Zoom to a family dinner, or maybe we can connect on a different day. So whatever that choice is, it's really important to stick to it, and to communicate that. So even if it's hard to say no to, your persistent aunt or your loving grandma, it's harder to live in a gray area where you can potentially disappoint them later on because they've had these expectations that haven't been cleared up yet. So it's really important to stick to those choices and communicate them to those who need to know. And so, we don't want to live in the gray or maybe area. And so what I mean by that is, if you're not going to be somewhere for Thanksgiving and somebody in your family asks you, hey, are you going to be coming for Thanksgiving dinner? It's best to say we don't have plans to be there this year than to say, oh, I don't know, we'll let you know, or we're still thinking about it, because it leaves people in limbo, and then it makes it harder for everybody to get their plans in order, which can also lead to some feelings of resentment or irritation later on. So what I would say to this is, even if you might disappoint some folks early on, it's better to do that early on and allow time to repair and come up with alternative plans than to kind of surprise them last minute and disappoint them no matter what. Another point that I just wanted to note is that when we talk about those who need to know about those decisions, this does include children and teens, because children and teens talk to one another, right? So they're talking to cousins and they're making plans with other family members. And so it's really important to minimize the disappointment with children and teens as well. And one thing that you can do to really do that is by letting them know once the decision is made. We're not going to go to Aunt Peggy's for Thanksgiving this year. We're going to do Thanksgiving at home. And that lets the kids and the teens know what to expect and doesn't cause any problems later on. So we've talked a little bit about just some different strategies to think about making those tough choices, but what's really important is to set boundaries around those choices too, right? So we often hear that boundaries can be tough to set because you feel like you're disappointing someone, right? Because oftentimes when we set boundaries, it does mean that we're saying no to something, right? Or it means we're saying not right now to something. But when you think about boundaries, if you think about it more from a perspective of, if I set these boundaries, then I'm allowing myself to focus on the things that are important to me, it becomes a lot easier to set them and stick to them. And so my first tip for really setting those boundaries around the holidays is to know yourself and to reflect on what you want your holiday season to look like. When you know what you want out of the holidays, what you want them to look like, who you want to be there with you, what you don't want to happen, that helps you be more assertive about making sure that you get those things, right? Making sure that your needs are met. Oftentimes we don't spend enough time reflecting on why we want, or why we have certain expectations. So it can become difficult to make sure that we set boundaries and help us attain those expectations. So, when you think about what you expect out of the holidays, think about who's around you, where are you, what are you doing, what does that gathering look like, and try to set boundaries that help you attain that for yourself. Another important part of setting boundaries is to honor your own needs. I think in the holidays, we get really caught up with focusing on others, right? It's a season of giving. And of course, we want to be generous and we want to be grateful during the holidays, and we want to remember all of the people in our lives that make our life that much better. But sometimes when we over focus on that, we forget ourselves and we forget our own needs. And so for many of us, as I've mentioned before, the holiday season does bring up grief. It does bring up loss. And so it's important to honor those feelings for yourself and remember your needs in that moment. Do you need to be around people? Do you need to have some alone time built in? So for me, I know my entire family lives in Brazil for the most part. So while I love spending the holidays here in the States with my husband and my mom, I do know that every year during Christmas, I have sort of this bittersweet feeling where I'm grateful for being around my close family, but I miss my family in Brazil, and I know that I am missing a whole lot when I can't always be there with them. And so that bittersweet feeling means that I really need to be in tune with my own needs, and I need to sort of know if I start to feel a little bit sad or a little bit lonely because I know my whole family's getting together in Brazil, that maybe I need to find a way to connect with them, or maybe I just need some alone time to reflect on how grateful I am to have such a big family in the first place. And so that's an example of what that looks like for me. And I hope that with that example, you can start to think about what your needs might look like for you this holiday season. Another big part of setting boundaries is learning to say no. And saying no has a negative connotation, right? Because it sort of implies that we're disappointing someone or we're not coming through for someone who we care about. But actually, that's one of those myths we need to dispel, right? Saying no is actually an act of love. It's an act of love towards yourself. It's also an act of love towards others, because if you commit to something that you know you don't have the bandwidth or the emotional capacity to take on right now, then it's very likely that you're not going to be your best self or give your best self, which doesn't help anybody in the long run. So when you think about, what you can take on or what you can handle this holiday season, remember that saying no is okay. And that you don't need to really justify your no or offer long-winded explanations, right? So I think a lot of times people feel like they need to really justify why they can't do something. So for example, let's say that this year you were asked to do the turkey for Thanksgiving. But let's just say that you've got a lot going on between managing your children's at-home learning and your remote work. And taking care of the turkey is not something that you can really take on without overstressing yourself. It's perfectly okay to say, this year I really can't cook the turkey. I've got a lot going on, but maybe I can support you with making some sides, right? That's a little bit of a minor example that has to do with cooking, but it gives you a sort of this idea that you can say no, and you don't really have to explain too much beyond that. That is your right. And in fact, when we say no, because we can't take something else on, it actually shows the other person not only that you are going to be honest and transparent about what you need out of that relationship, but it also gives them an opportunity to step in and potentially help to support you as well. So don't always feel like you need to take on everything during the holidays. It's okay to say no. And in fact, it's an act of love towards yourself and towards the other person. And also, simplifying is a great way to kind of set some boundaries without feeling like you're setting really strict ones. And so what I mean by this is whatever simplifying the holidays looks like for you, whether that means that maybe your spread at the holidays is not as in-depth as it was in past years. Or maybe it means that this holiday season you'll spend with your immediate family and not include extended family. Or maybe, simplifying for your family means that you're not going to be doing gifts, right? So whatever that looks like for your family, it's okay every now and then to take a step back and find ways where you can simplify or take some of the stress out of the details, right? And so that can look really different, but I encourage you to really reflect and take an inventory on the tasks that you've taken on this holiday season, the expectations that you have, and think about, where can I simplify some things? Where can I make this easier on myself? That's a boundary in and of itself, right? To make sure that we don't take on more than we can. And so another big point here is to take care of yourself. And I'll address a little bit more on that later because we do have a section on self-care. But as always, whenever we're talking about boundaries, whenever we set boundaries, we set them as a form of self-care. And so it makes sense that we also want to build in self-care practices and set boundaries around those practices to make sure that we stay intentional and mindful about them throughout the holiday season. And I do see some folks in the chat room making some great comments just about some families decided not to give gifts this year. And then also the idea of struggling to make decisions and then dealing with that aftermath, right? Especially if people don't understand the thought process that went behind that decision. And so if you're in a situation where you've made a decision around the holidays and you're getting some backlash from close family members, it's important to reflect on how much about your decision do you want to share, right? And how much detail does that person need? For example, I know that if my mom had some issues with my holiday decisions, she might get a little bit more background information as to why we made those decisions than maybe somebody else in my family, right? Because I want her to really understand where I'm coming from and really understand why we made that choice. And so if there's room there to kind of convey some understand or help the other person understand why you made that choice, that might be a good strategy just to help them understand, this isn't about me not wanting to be with the family or me not wanting to spend time with you. This is about me wanting to keep my grandmother who lives with us safe, or this is about me wanting to make sure that we're not putting you in danger because we're working out in the public. So every family has to make some different decisions, but if you find that you're getting some backlash for your decisions and you really want to help repair those relationships, let people in on sort of the reasons why you made those decisions. Help them discover your insights and your perspectives, and that might help them understand. But if they don't understand, that's okay too. I saw a quote recently that really stood out to me about setting boundaries. And it was that, setting boundaries sometimes means that we disappoint others. And that's a fact that's hard to wrap our brains around. But sometimes we can't please everyone, right? And so I think if you go into the decision-making process with that in mind, doesn't make it any easier per se, but it does help you sort of honor your needs and stay loyal to yourself, right? So keeping those things in mind, I hope will be helpful in kind of dealing with some backlash if you make a decision that family members don't agree with. And because I could spend all day talking to you about boundaries, I did want to offer you an opportunity to dive a little bit deeper. We did a program not too long ago, and it was presented by HRI Director Dr. Christine Murray. And the program was on having healthy communication and boundaries in all relationships. And while the program topic did not solely focus on the holidays, if you are somebody who does struggle with sort of setting and keeping boundaries and communicating your needs around why you set those boundaries, we do encourage you to check this program out, maybe dive in a little bit deeper into how you can really put some things in place to make sure that you're honoring your own needs. And so that program is Healthy Communication and Boundaries in Relationships. So moving on to self-care, I mentioned earlier that self-care is actually a great way to set boundaries, but also when we set boundaries, it's a form of self-care as well. So when we talk about self-care, it's any activity that you do to take care of your mental, emotional, and or physical health. So it doesn't have to be something very big. It doesn't have to be a day at the spa. It could be a walk around the block. But the point is that it's deliberate and intentional to serve a mental or emotional or physical need of yours. And so when you think about that, it's really about giving yourself what you need and not what you want, right? So it's about drinking that water. It's about getting that exercise. And it's not always so much about getting a manicure or getting a haircut, right? And so when we think about where do we start with self-care, especially because during the holidays, it's hard to find the time to begin with, right? So if you don't have a self-care practice already built into your routine, it can be tough to start during the holidays. So one thing to keep in mind is to sort of go back to the basics. And these are the 3 golden rules of self-care. And so the first one is sticking to those basics and really not underestimating the power of drinking water, getting sleep, moving your body, eating well, enjoying the company of the people that you love, taking time for laughter, taking time for fun, for reflection, for silence, right? For deep breathing. Those things might seem minimal when we just kind of think about them on their own. But when you combine these actions day after day, that can really lead to a really effective self-care sort of regimen that helps you to not only stay emotionally balanced, but helps you stay clear, so you can make clear and level-headed, so you can make some good decisions. So the first really golden rule of self-care is to just stick to the basics when all else fails. The second piece, which is almost just as important, is planning for it, right? So we don't want to wait until we have time to practice self-care. We want to make the time for self-care. And so whether that means you're scheduling it in your calendar or doing it every morning when you wake up before you do anything else, it's important to hold yourself accountable and make sure that it happens, and be honest with yourself, right? If you're somebody who needs a phone alert to remember to get up and move your body, make sure you put that phone alert in so that you don't forget to do that. And then finally, this last point of, is it working? I think sometimes we get caught up in doing what is prescribed, right? So if we say that yoga is good for self-care, then everybody's got to do yoga, right? But that's not necessarily the case. And so self-care is about what works for you. You know, yoga might not be what calms you down. Deep breathing might not be what calms you down. So really reflecting on, you know, does walking around the block and listening to music help me feel more emotionally calm? If the answer is yes, then you want to keep doing that. But if the answer is no, or not all the time, then you might want to find some other strategies to put in place to help you make sure that what you're doing is working and is effective. And so now, as we get into our takeaway points, I do want to encourage any questions in the chat room through Zoom or through Facebook. But I did want to sort of wrap up with some takeaway points for today. And that is when you're thinking about making these tough choices around the holidays, you always want to communicate transparently with those that are making the decisions with you. And you want to communicate about what your ideas are, what your expectations are, as well as the things that you don't really want to happen or you don't want to see happen. You also want to reflect on your own expectations to make sure you're not telling yourself a narrative that might be impossible to attain, right? So what are those myths that you might be telling yourself about what the holidays should look like in your family that are not only unrealistic, can also be difficult to or not only unrealistic, it might not have even happened in your family, right? So oftentimes I hear people say, we're going to have this, you know, perfect holiday season with everyone together and no arguments and no conflict, when maybe that's, you know, maybe that's never happened before in any family gathering. Maybe that's a family that has a lot of conflict. So just being really realistic about what your thoughts are and making sure that you are getting your ideas about your holidays from your own expectations and not from other places. And then also, you know, once you make those tough choices with those decision makers, it's really important to stick to those choices and to communicate those to the people that need to know as soon as possible, right? So we don't want to have people sort of living in this gray area, not knowing if we're going to attend a gathering or not knowing if we're going to host or not. So once you make a choice, even if it's a tough choice that you know you'll get some backlash for, it's really important for everyone to know early on, so you don't sort of have this confusion and these unrealistic expectations. It's also very important, as I mentioned, to set boundaries, to keep those boundaries, and to make sure you're taking care of yourself throughout the holidays. When we take time for ourselves and are mindful about our own self-care, we do a lot better in terms of interacting with others and in terms of strengthening our other relationships. So really important to build in that time for your self-care. And if there are any other points that you really took away from this program today or something that you would like to share, please go ahead and share those in the chat room. We would love to share those with other participants as well. I do see a question that came up here, and the question is, how can I deal with guilt when I know a decision I want to make, but I feel bad about disappointing the people that I care about? It's a great question, because I think at some level, we all face this internal dilemma around the holidays, right? It seems as if we all make a decision at some point during the holiday season that disappoints someone else. And that can be really tough to wrap our brains around, especially because we want everyone to feel loved during the holidays, and we want the holidays to be a positive experience. So with that in mind, I'll offer some strategies, and I hope that they will be helpful for those who are struggling with this same dilemma. The first thing is to really ramp up your self-care if you find yourself feeling guilt or negative emotions about the decisions that you're making. And you might also want to ramp up some of the reflective self-care practices. So for example, spending time journaling, spending time thinking about what you're grateful for, what you want out of the holiday season, the things that are important to you. When you are in tune with why you feel the way you feel, why you make the decisions that you make, when you're in tune with that and you know sort of the reason behind your emotions and your thoughts, you feel a little bit more confident in conveying those thoughts to others. And so that is helpful in the communication piece itself. So if I feel really confident in my choice because I know that it's coming from a place where I've reflected and I've thought about what's important to me, when I convey that choice to somebody in my family who might not agree, that confidence is conveyed along with it, right? And so even if they're disappointed, even if they don't love my choice, they're more likely to respect it because I'm standing by it, right? So that's an important thing to think about. If you find yourself still struggling with that guilt, even if the other person's not making you feel guilty, then it's really important to think to yourself, why do I have that guilt? Is this, does this have to do more with my relationship with this particular person, or does this have to do with the actual decision I've made around the holidays? Because I think a lot of times when we are interacting with loved ones over the holidays, there's a lot of other relationship implications that come to that conversation outside of the holiday discussion, right? There might be past concerns or past struggles that you might have had to work through with that person that sort of come to light in this discussion about the holidays. So really reflecting on that relationship and thinking, you know, is it guilt? Am I feeling guilty because of my decision, or is there something else going on with this relationship that I need to explore and dive into? And then finally, you know, I think it's really important during the holidays for us to think about what honoring our needs and the needs of our immediate family members. So, you know, the people that we live with, the people, our children, our spouse. And that's not to say that other family members are not important, but it's to say that the holidays are about honoring the needs of your needs and your loved ones. And sometimes that means that other people don't feel heard and don't feel involved, and that's okay. Unfortunately, we can't please everybody all of the time, but what we can do is we can convey our points with respect and hope that others will understand. And if they don't understand, we can feel confidence in knowing that we've really thought those decisions through and we feel good about those choices. So I hope that answered your question. And so as we move on here, I did want to bring your attention to another program that we're having next week. We've talked a little bit today about some of the financial stressors that people are facing. And I've even heard some folks today say that they're, you know, not even gifting this year or thinking differently about some gift about how they will gift. And so HRI is actually hosting a program next week with 2 expert speakers on just this whole idea of giving and receiving gifts during this holiday, during the pandemic. And so if that's something that you're struggling with, we do encourage you to check that out. That will be next Wednesday from 12 to 1. And then we also will have a Coping with Loneliness panel coming up in December. For those of you who caught our first Coping with Loneliness program last week, it was such a hit that we decided to bring it back, and now we're going to be hearing from some experts on how to cope with loneliness. And so that might be interesting to those who are attending today as well. And so if there are no other questions in the chat room or on Facebook, I will close today's program by thanking everyone for being here with me today, and really just encouraging everyone to think about their needs and their family needs during this holiday season, and communicating those needs with the people that need to know as soon as you can. That's the best way to really avoid miscommunication and confusion down the line. And for those of you who are with us live, I would love to get your feedback on today's program. I did just send that link in the chat room through Zoom now. And so we would love to hear your thoughts on today's program. And we also encourage you to connect with HRI for a future one. So thank you so much for joining us. I hope that you've gained some insights that can help you make some tough choices around the holidays this year. And I wish everyone a restful holiday season with lots of good memories for all. So thank you everyone for joining us. Make sure you stay connected with HRI at www.healthyrelationshipsinitiative.org and on Facebook and Instagram at Healthy Relationships Initiative. So thanks everyone. Take care.